at controversiality, views, reviews, and controversial discussions. Let's talk about some of the reasons why I think this is a great book. This book, Feminism for Women, The Real Route to Liberation by Julie Bindel. I've read this book a couple of times. It was published in 2021. I've also listened to some of the audio. I do prefer the book. I would say it's a great resource for finding out a bit more about feminism. The author recognises that there are different experiences, they're different women, but she also recognises that it's okay to disagree with her. It's open to debate, which I thought was great. She does also validate victims, survivors, and allies to liberate women from the patriarchy and from violence against women and girls. She has conducted lots of different interviews with lots of different women from all around the world, which she has included some of that in this book. She encourages men to read this book as well. There's an opinion in this book about her thoughts on so-called men's rights activist organisations, basically saying that they don't specifically support male victims, but almost like their intention is to discredit women. While the author doesn't discuss female perpetrators, she doesn't deny it. This is specifically about feminism for women. And she specifically talks about feminism not necessarily being about equality, but more about liberation. In her opinion, men have more power than women, and so why would men want equality with women? As the front cover suggests, the real route to liberation for women from the patriarchy. It's not necessarily about equality. She does mention in the book certainly issues of violence against women, and this idea that if we had equality, would equality reduce violence? No, it wouldn't. So yeah, I think that's a great point to make about liberation rather than just equality. I think this author has received quite a lot of protesters when they've spoken at events, and I think she's quite specific in this book that there is just simply an attempt to silence women who have basically been oppressed and are making influential change, which makes sense, right? That's oppression. Influential change to improve the lives of women. Yeah, I think the statements throughout the book of what feminism is to the author was really good. I also think this book does encourage critical thinking. I did start to think about my own experiences and my experiences as a feminist. There are some discussions, difficult discussions within the book. If you are new to this content and you're not familiar with feminism, you may find it difficult to read. But yeah, I think this would certainly be a good book to read within a group of women, to raise consciousness, to raise awareness, to have those discussions, and hopefully, if anyone is doing that, hopefully have the right people in that group so that they can support each other and have some critical discussions about what this book means to them, or different issues that are brought up, different ways of thinking, or if it's kind of different issues to explore. For people who have heard about Julie Bindel, who are quite who find this author quite offensive, basically based on her opinions that she does not align with any kind of trans ideology. and that she doesn't believe people can change sex. She has received a lot of threats, no doubt, intimidation, usually being called a TERF or a SWIF. And so, yeah. And the trans ideology views are kind of widely accepted in society, so it doesn't take a lot for people to hear these things and ultimately make an opinion about someone based on something they've been told. And I think it's important that we make our own decisions and we be open-minded. I certainly didn't read this book and think this woman is hateful. She doesn't appear to threaten anybody in comparison to the threats that she's received. It's important that we make our own decisions, decide for ourselves, right? And you're not going to do that without reading. And as I've said, she's very open to debate, to challenge. She's aware that people have different opinions. This is her opinion. Depending on your own beliefs, your own thoughts, what you've heard about this author, you may want to disregard the book before you've even started reading it, but I would certainly say it is worth a read. Let's get into what this author is actually about. So Julie Bindel describes herself on Substack as a feminist, an author, a journalist and a broadcaster exploring the issue of misogyny, and she also has a podcast called The Lesbian Project. Further online researches that I did, including Spinifex Press, the School of Law website and University of Reading, describes the author as a researcher in the campaign to end violence towards women and children since 1979. She's written extensively on rape, domestic violence, sexual motivated murder, prostitution, trafficking, child sexual exploitation, stalking, and the rise of fundamentalism and its harm to women and girls. Julie Bindel is also a co-founder of Justice for Women, which was set up in 1990. She's a grassroots campaigner involved in advocacy and government consultation since 1999. Julie has supported a number of NGOs and IGOs in an effort to prevent trafficking into sexual exploitation, improve the prosecution of perpetrators, protect victims, and build international counter-trafficking partnerships. Wow. Yeah, there was no word of TERF or SWIF in that description. If you don't advocate for that and you're not bothered about the safety of women and girls or even women and children, then this book probably isn't for you, and neither is this video. So much needed conversations that are discussed in this book. It's got 8 chapters and it finishes with a conclusion chapter. Each chapter starts with a quote from a woman, which I thought was great. So we're going to get into some of the discussion points throughout the book. And I just want to say I used to love this colour as a kid. Black, white and pink really is quite a statement. Julie Bindel, she does specifically recognise that men and women are different and demands that women are not abused for these differences. And she mentions the need for women-only spaces such as prisons, and she references statistics about male violence. Murder, the lack of rape convictions, abuse of porn. I do agree that porn is abusive, and I think it's horrendous that the government has taken so long to introduce age verification to reduce the amount of children that are exposed to watching such traumatic content online. Like, she does mention the activist group We Can't Consent to This, that helped change the 2020 domestic abuse bill. Police response to domestic abuse and victim blaming. There is an acknowledgement in the book of children being victims of domestic abuse. Comparisons are made between men and women within what she calls sex tourism and the sex trade. Prostitution, and when she talks about sex work, she does put those specific words in quotation marks because she doesn't agree that prostitution is sex work, and the idea of choice as well, she puts it in quotation marks. I kind of agree a bit with this because I don't think prostitution can be sex work. If you've seen my other videos, I do make a comment. Thankfully, it's not promoted in the job centre. I do think it is a form of abuse. This idea of choice, that why wouldn't men want to promote that women are making a choice? Because for them, they're promoting the idea that they can use a woman for sexual gratification and objectification, and so why wouldn't they promote the idea that women are making a choice and promote this idea of feminism being, about women being able to decide for themselves about what they want to do with their bodies. Pimping, pornography, surrogacy, the selling of women's bodies. She disagrees with all of those. And she's very clear as well that financial coercion isn't a choice, and I agree with that absolutely. She does also challenge this idea that men can be feminists, and she promotes, rather than men claiming to be feminist, she promotes this idea of being pro-feminist. She does mention male allies. She also mentions that it's important for men to recognise this because it will allow them to challenge male behaviour. I think this is a good point to make, but I do think that there is a place where men also discuss being victims of male violence, maybe not necessarily as victims, but to acknowledge the suffering of women and to acknowledge how men also suffer from the patriarchy, to understand and challenge male violence and the patriarchy, not just from other men, but also from themselves. I do kind of believe that feminism, although it is for women, it would also improve the lives of men in some way. Yes, some men aren't going to have as much power as they did. They're not going to be able to control as much or abuse as much as they did. But if it's going to improve a society, it's going to improve the society, not just for women but for men. So it is important that men are part of that discussion, because men are also harmed by male violence. I was glad to see this point in the book where Julie Bindel also recognises that gay men, they're not free from misogyny, and they're actually colluding with it. And the reason I think that is because there used to be, I don't know if there is now, but this idea that a gay man is a woman's best friend, right? Because somehow gay men are safe around women. And she's clearly making the point there that they're not the men. Her experience of being a lesbian and a feminist, difference between sex and gender, and sex stereotypes. The idea to promote a heterosexual relationship within the patriarchy, and therefore being a lesbian really challenges that idea. I thought was interesting. And her being accused of being a man hater, which I don't think you have to be lesbian to do that. You just have to stand up for women's rights. The aim of that is no different, right? It's to silence her and to keep women in the place. She does also mention language. She does mention guys. I have said guys before, with the idea that it's kind of inclusive. The foundations of that in itself, guys, is in reference to males. I think there's a lot more to be discussed about language and change of language. She's a journalist. She does interview women from around the world, gender and sex, debate, discussion, recognition. She does talk about women being innate. She's very specific on the front cover that it is for women, and regardless of those differences of women, that feminism is for all women to collectively overcome the oppression of patriarchy. There are a lot of references to other campaigns. She's very clear that pornography and prostitution is violence against women. Her point that being a lesbian and challenging domestic and sexual violence, rape and marriage, for example, are seen as problematic, and therefore she is accused of men hating. She does mention men's rights organisations that have existed, for example, False Memory Syndrome Society, which would ultimately discredit allegations of sexual abuse. Feminism isn't necessarily about equality, it is about liberation. That's my first book discussion at controversiality, views, reviews, and controversial discussions. I'm certainly going to be speaking up a lot more.